Finishing a song may be the hardest part of producing a song. And to make that difficulty easier, I've put together a checklist of all the things that needs to be done to get a track finished. And now I need to put it to the test. The goal is to have a clear step-by-step roadmap that you can apply to any of your songs to get it done. So to refine that list, I am going to use it to finish 12 of my old songs that I've made over the last 6 years, to then release them as an album. To finish these songs, I will need to review them from their core structure up to the end of the mix, so we should see a lot of composition, production and mixing tricks along the way. And the song I will start with today is my popcorn song I made in April 2018 using samples I recorded while cooking popcorn. Before I start making it sound better, I needed to make sure the song was in its best form. So the first step on my list was to name each part of the song to get a clear view of the structure of the song. So I divided it into 6 parts. First, there is the intro. Then is what I called bread and butter when the kicks comes in. This is like the foundations of the track. Then is part A with the voice samples. And the next part is part B with the little melody played by what sounds like a plastic piano. Then comes the break with a big change in rhythm. Then the part A comes back, but on the rhythm of the break. And then is the outro, which is just like the part A, and that finishes on the voice sample. Now, from there, I need to do several things before I can start mixing it. So here's the plan I'm going to follow that you can apply to your own songs. First, check the structure of the song, see if the parts are in the right order and if they are too short or too long. Second, check the instruments. Clean them or possibly replace them completely to start with good sounds. Third, check the tracks. If a track holds 2 instruments, split it in 2. And then add instruments that could be missing or remove instruments that are unnecessary. Fourth, add movement, like adding automations to instruments so it doesn't sound too static. And fifth, add transitions and ear candies, so each part flows from one to the next in a dynamic way. So now that we have the theory, let's see how it went in practice. I thought the intro was too long, so I cut it in half and rebuilt the same transition after 8 bars instead of 16. You can hit Ctrl Shift and X to cut apart and collapse the empty space it left behind. Then I decided the last part A was too short before the outro, so I duplicated the part B right after it. The Ctrl-Shift-V shortcut is handy to paste a part in between things, because it creates a space for what you're pasting instead of pasting it over what's already there. I then customized it by copy-pasting voice samples, chords and hats, so it's not the same exact part B than earlier in the song. Then I finished off the structure by replacing the hats in the outro by the hats of another part, and I used this reverb snare to create a new pattern. Usually, this is a good time to write down what you like and dislike about each sound in your track, so you can stay focused and don't waste too much time. And this is always easier said than done, because we always waste time as we need to try stuff. Like, oh, what if I take this bass and play it an octave up and add saturation and layer it with... Yeah, so here is what I wrote. On the good side, I like the nostalgic vibe of the song, I liked the soft aspect of the bass, the light tone of the song, and some hats that I found groovy. And on the bad side, I thought that the mix overall sounded weak and needed to be fuller. I thought the kick was bad, I was not sure about the snare, some hats had some weird background noises, the popcorn rhythm sounded weak and I was not even sure about this rhythm, and in fact I was not really sure about the whole break section. I thought it needed to be fuller and groovier, and overall I thought it needed a lot more work. So I started with the drums, and the first sample I was not happy with was the kick. It was kind of weak and just didn't sound very good. So I went looking for a better kick to replace it, and ended up layering 2 kicks by taking the high click of one and the boomy low end of the other. I shortened both samples to make the kick tighter, and ended up with this. So I rewrote all the kick patterns for the song and adjusted the kick's volume, then moved to the snare. I wasn't sure I wanted to keep that snare, so same process, I looked for another sample, but instead of replacing it completely, I decided to add it as an extra layer to give it more bite. So I adjusted the EQ, the tuning, the length and the envelope of each layer to blend them together. Also, I noticed I had a different reverb for each layer, which was weird, so I corrected that by putting a single reverb on the whole group. So I went from this to this. Next up were the hi-hats, and it had a very bad background noise. So I used the gate to remove it. Then to make it pop, I added a little amount of OTT and high-passed it, so I ended up with this. Next was the bass, that I'd like to keep smooth but make it a bit more present. So I tried to put a distortion on it, but this added a nasty tone to it. So I tried to distort only the top end, and it revealed this sound. So to get rid of it, I've put an EQ earlier in my chain to remove those higher frequencies before it went to the distortion. Then I added an OTT and I played with the high frequency split point to dial how much I wanted of this high-pitched sound in the bass. And finally, I added a sidechain compression. And with that, the bass and the drums were ready, but now I wanted to tidy them up a bit so they would play better together. I know this is more on the mixing side already, and I know we're only preparing for mixing at this stage, but sometimes you need everything to sound better to see clearer if everything can go together. So on the snare, I made the attack longer on the new layer, and I made it play with some claps so every other snare sound different. Then I reviewed the volume and the length of the kick and did very little adjustments on the voice samples. And lastly, I wasn't sure about the popcorn sounds and their rhythm, so I tried to put a transient shaper on that to make it pop more. No pun intended. I like to use the transient shaper from Kilohertz for that, because I think it makes what the plugin is supposed to do very clear visually. Now is a good time to clearly identify the main element in each part. This will make the next steps easier. Here the main elements are always the vocal samples when they play. Then it would be the plastic piano melody, and during the break I would like the bass and the rhythm to come forward. So the next step was to separate elements that could be playing on the same track, to make them easier to mix. For example, the snare track was holding the snares and the shakers, so I separated them. Like with those reverb snares that I duplicated to make a pattern. Right now they all sound the same, but I separated the short and the long notes so I can make them more distinct later. And also this plastic piano instrument was playing both chords and melodies, so I might want to mix them differently. So there are two tracks now. And I even separated some voice samples between the melodic ones and the spoken ones. Now that everything is clear and organized, it was time to see if I needed to add any instrument, or if any instrument needed to be removed. The part that needed the most work was the break, so I started with that. I first loaded Vital on a new bass track to create a top layer to add grit and texture to the bass. Then I noticed that when the two bass layers played together, it sounded like shit. And that was because every instrument was tuned almost half a half step up, which is weird. But instead of retuning everything, I decided to detune my new layer, and after a few adjustments, they sounded like this. So I added a sub, which is just a filtered square wave, and then I decided I didn't really like the top layer I just did, so I deleted it and made another one from scratch. Then I duplicated the main bass so I could treat it differently for the break than for the rest of the song. So after a bit of cleaning and group compression, it sounded like this. Which is not bad, but I thought it was a bit too static, so I added automations on some EQ, filters and distortion. And this felt like I was getting a bit ahead of myself, as adding movement was at the end of my checklist. But in the moment, I needed to build this section a bit more to see more clearly where it was going. So after that, I kept some of those bass layers until the end of the song to keep that extra energy and thickness. In the section right after the break, I removed some voice samples from the first half to make it breathe a little, because I thought it was a bit too repetitive. And the last instrument I wanted to add was some hi-hats at the end of the part A, to keep the energy level rising, even if the hats stayed really in the background. And once I had them, I've also added them on the break and a couple other places. Now, the next step was to add movement, where the song feels a little too static. I already started to do that, so I only diminished the level of the melody in the break to let the bass and the drums take all the space, and I've also copied the bass pattern of the break into the next section, so the whole part feels more like one block and it will emphasize the return of the 4-to-the-floor beats that comes next. Another way to add movement is to add transitions between parts. And here, having split all the instruments in different tracks and groups turned out to be very handy. I added transit on a group with the piano and the voices, chose a preset that could fit, and rearranged the other instruments to support the transition. I also decided to record a single note of the piano, to reverse it, and use it as a little riser. I thought that was very cool, so I reused both the transition and this reverse note. To emphasize the transition, I also added another transit on the drum track here. And I added a much simpler transition here where I just muted everything before the next part to create contrast. And with this, the song was supposed to be ready for mixing. This is the end of the checklist. But of course, I still wanted to correct a few things, so I had to run through another iteration of this list. So to make it quick, here's a sum up of the last corrections I did. I decided to pitch up the short reverb snares so they would be different than the long ones on the track below. This popcorn rhythm during the break was still bugging me, so I tried to delete unnecessary hits to make the rhythm clearer and groovier. The break still lacked some groove, so I tried to put a sidechain gate on the bass so it will play only when the popcorn rhythm plays. But I wasn't very convinced with that neither, so I tried to make it better by duplicating some of those reverse notes to use them more like ear candies or background elements. And then I decided to rewrite the rhythm of the popcorn entirely to see it more clearly. I removed some of the hits to find the groove that was hiding in there. And once done, I duplicated this new track, loaded a bunch of different hi-hat sounds in the drum rack, and added a random MIDI effect, so different hat sound would be played randomly with every note. And now we were cooking some groove, so I tried the same thing but with random electronic drum sound. After fiddling with it, I decided I would keep and mix the three layers, the snare, the hats, and electronic noises. The problem here is that those tracks would play different sounds each time I play it, because of these random effects. So I recorded their MIDI notes on a new track and used those new MIDI clips to control the drum racks. This way I could choose the parts I preferred, and it made sure they played the same thing every time. I was finally beginning to be happy with this break. We are approaching the final line. I added an autopan on the hat on the break to slide the rhythm into 16th note. I thought it would groove more. I removed an annoying resonance on the kick at 167 Hz to make it softer, and I lowered the bass. I added pads on the second part of the break as I thought it was still lacking something. The pads were built from the chords I already had. I just changed the envelope. And now to add rhythm to it, I used Shape a Box. I found a preset I liked, but rewrote the rhythm. And then I added two autopans effects. The first would make the volume go up over 2 bars, and the second sliced everything in 16th note, so I used it sporadically to add a bit of variation. I added a melody on the second part B because I thought this part lacked a main element. I added a completely new part just before the end of the song with only the kick and the bass because I was listening to that and I was like, damn, this is a mood that would be a shame not to have a phase with it. I added a lead, which was basically just the bass 3 octaves higher. I built a small riser to introduce it by recording the first note, adding reverb to it, and then reversing the whole thing. Then I added another transition on there, reversed piano notes on the last page also, to make it sound a bit more complete. I retouched some of the voice sample patterns throughout the song to add a bit of variety. And finally, I retouched the way each instrument disappeared at the end of the song to, again, add variety so it's less repetitive, but also to make it end better. And with this, the song was finally finished and I am very happy with the results. It is now ready for the final mix, even though we surely did a little bit of mixing already, which I should maybe add on my checklist to make it more accurate. But that is the thing. This is not really a linear process, even though I try to make it look linear with this checklist, because the list was more like one iteration of what I had to repeat a couple of times. This video is probably 15 or 20 minutes long, but this is the result of about 10 hours of work spread out over a week. So I couldn't really show everything, all the fiddling, all the doubts, all the things I tried that I didn't keep. This kind of video makes it look like it's easy, but I think it's normal to go back and forth until things click and you start being happy with what you've done. And I'm very happy with the results and I will play you the whole song now. So in the meantime, if you like this content, don't hesitate to like and subscribe. I will come back soon to show you how I mix this track, so if you are after mixing tricks, this will be all in one video. Huge thanks to my Patreons for their incredible support. Thank you for watching, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and don't hesitate to tell me what you think about this song. Bye, see you soon!